CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.
Now the news. I'm Shane Bigham. China's top legislature has expressed opposition to the U.S. signing of the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act into law. The Foreign Affairs Committee of the National People's Congress says the U.S. Act fabricates the so-called forced labor issue in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and grossly interferes in China's internal affairs under the pretext of human rights. The Chinese central government has criticized the United States and a few other Western countries for interfering in Hong Kong affairs in the name of democracy. The State Council Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office says democracy is being used by the U.S. to consolidate its hegemony and meddle with others' internal affairs. The office also describes the U.S. export of democracy as a culprit for political chaos, social division, and pain for civilians in many countries, including Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and Syria. The Chinese foreign minister says the country's relations with Peru have developed steadily and become a front runner in China-Latin America relations. Wang Yi made the remarks in a phone conversation with Peruvian Foreign Minister Oscar Martua. Wang says China is willing to work with Peru to advance the two nations' comprehensive strategic partnership to a higher level. The Peruvian diplomat said his country sincerely thanks China for supporting the Latin American nation's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic and is willing to strengthen cooperation in healthcare and the resumption of work and production. Japan will send 3 officials to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games. Tokyo 2020 Organizing Committee President Seiko Hashimoto, Japanese Olympic Committee Chairman Yasuhiro Yamashita, and Japanese Paralympic Committee President Kazuyuki Mori will attend. With the approach of the Beijing Winter Olympics, China's aiming to get 300 million people involved in snow and ice sports. Liaoning province's cold temperatures give it a natural advantage in this respect over warmer parts of the country. Yo Yang reports.
Ice sports are popular here in Shenyang. Fan Zixuan is one of the amateurs, and he's already been figure skating for 6 years.
I'm 11. My mother took me to the ice rink, and I fell in love with figure skating. I fell and hurt my face the last time, but I still love this sport and really want to keep practicing it.
Fan has become a little star on this rink, but all these dazzling techniques come from hard work and perseverance. Jianghan Jingyi is one of the girls playing ice hockey, and this 10-year-old has already been in several international competitions.
I like ice hockey. It's very exciting. My team and I have competed with teenagers from Russia. They were very strong. It was an unforgettable experience for me.
China has been on a mission to get more people, around 300 million, into winter sports. A 2020 survey by the German university suggests that around half that number participated in some form of ice and snow sport during the winter season. And Chinese authorities say they expect that numbers to keep growing, especially among teenagers.
Spain's tourism-dependent economy has seen a big rebound this year. A successful vaccination drive and low infection rate have attracted many tourists. However, the rise of Omicron cases across Europe means the future of the crucial sector remains uncertain. Rahul Patak has more.
Another busy morning at the roommate Hotel Alba in central Madrid. Occupancy levels are getting back up to where they were 2 years ago. The majority of visitors are foreigners coming to enjoy a city break, and tourism figures show that Madrid, like the rest of Spain, is bouncing back, reaching 2/3 of its pre-pandemic levels. That has allowed the hospitality industry to finally get back on its feet and offer much-needed job opportunities. 1 in 8 people in Spain work in the sector. To help slow the transmission of new variants, tourist spots such as the Costa Blanca have insisted on COVID certificates. Each region will continue to assess the situation. The government has also pledged a series of funds through the EU, up to $800 million, to help digitise the industry. But leading experts feel the most pressing issue is still the same.
Official figures show that the combined profits of China's state-owned enterprises surged over 40% year-on-year, exceeding 4.1 trillion yuan in the first 11 months. The finance ministry says the SOEs saw their operating revenue rise 21.4% from a year earlier to 67.3 trillion yuan during this period. The operating revenue of China's centrally administered SOEs amounted to over 37.4 trillion yuan in the January through November period. And that's the news. I'm Shane Bigham.
We keep you informed and
is World Today.
Hello and welcome to the panel discussion of World Today, a news program from a different perspective. I'm Ding in Beijing. Ukraine is now at the center of a soaring geopolitical tension with the United States and Kiev accusing Russia of planning a military attack on its southern neighbor. Moscow, of course, denies this particular allegation. Speaking on his annual news conference on Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia doesn't want a Ukraine war, but needs immediate response to its demand for security guarantees.
Наши действия будут зависеть не от хода переговоров.
Our actions will not depend on the course of the negotiations, but on the unconditional compliance with Russia's security today and from a historical perspective. In this context, we've made it clear that NATO's further eastward expansion is unacceptable. This is what we're talking about. It's not about us threatening someone. Have we come to the borders of the US or the UK maybe? No, they came to our borders. You should not demand guarantees from us. You must give us the guarantees. It's up to you, and you must do this immediately, right now.
That was Russian President Vladimir Putin on Ukraine. In the meantime, though, there is also a positive note. According to President Putin, Russia has received a generally positive initial response to the security proposals it handed over to the United States earlier this month. And Putin also said negotiations could start early next year in Geneva. So in this edition of the program, we will take a look at the direction in which the Ukrainian crisis is developing and whether there can be a viable solution. So if you want to listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Joining us now on the line is Mark Sloboda, a Moscow-based international relations and security analyst. Good afternoon.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Also joining us from Britain is Dr. Wayne Grant, Emeritus Professor of Politics with the University of Warwick. Good morning to you.
Hello, good to speak to you.
And finally joining us here in Beijing is Professor Chu Bo from China Foreign Affairs University. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. Hi.
Okay, so Mark, to start with you, let's begin by talking about or by evaluating the real risks on the ground, because a few weeks ago, American Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin issued a statement saying that Russia could invade, let's say, quote unquote, invade Ukraine as soon as early 2022. How do you view such kind of assessment?
Well, I think it is indeed an extremely tense geopolitical situation right now. The U.S.-backed Kiev regime currently has about 125,000 troops, which is over half of its entire conscript military, on the border with Russia in the area around the East Ukraine, Donbass. Russia, meanwhile, according to the latest U.S. assessments at least, also has close to that number, around 22,000 troops on its side. And according to the numbers out in the last 24 hours by the Russian Ministry of Defense, NATO currently has over 10,000, quote, trainers and advisors, unquote, in East Ukraine alongside the Kiev regime forces. At this point, Russia has said that, the refusal by the Kiev regime to fulfill the now 7-year-old Minsk Accords and, continuing a frozen conflict that still amounts to artillery shelling nearly every day in the east of the country, is a security threat both to Russia and to the region. And we have to remember that the Minsk Accords are now enshrined in international law. They have been accepted by the Security Council, including the 3 Western members, the US, the UK, and France. And Russia sees the slow creeping de facto NATOization of the Kiev regime-controlled parts of Ukraine continue, with the UK announcing the construction of naval bases in the region, the large number of troops, and the large amount of very lethal advanced U.S. and other NATO military equipment being delivered to the regime, which, of course, is intended to kill its own people, because that is a civil conflict that has occurred in the country over the last 7 years, with some 14,000 plus dead.
Okay, so Professor Grant, what is your assessment of the situation on the ground? Do you think amassing of military personnel, amassing of troops on the border area, on both sides of the border area, necessarily equate to a military conflict in the end?
Well, clearly, it is a tense situation, and I think there's always the possibility of further intensification of this artillery shelling, which was referred to by the last speaker. We could see more of that. I mean, I don't think it is necessarily the case, as the U.S. Defense Secretary claimed, that there is going to be an incursion in the immediate future into Ukraine. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen.
Okay, so Professor Chu, if we take a look at some of the Western media headlines regarding this particular situation on the ground, usually Western media stories tend to describe the current situation or the current tension as Russian aggression towards Ukraine. So from your perspective, do you think aggression is the right sort of description here?
So we have to look at the nature of the Ukraine crisis by now since almost over 7 years, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the key is about the strategic and especially the geopolitical interest for Russia in the Ukraine, and especially in the former Soviet Union blocs. And we know, like the Ukraine backlars are the very important geopolitical buffer zones for Russia. So since the 1997 and pre-1, Ukraine and other the former European, the former Soviet Union republicans joined the NATO. That is the right land for Russia. So if we look at absolutely, we can know, and the Russia has taken over the Crimea, and now there is the military. The military conflicts over the along the borders. So that could be currently the Russia already takes some advantage. But I think the Russians' strategic goal in Ukraine is limited. And from the very realistic perspective is reasonable. So when we look at and I think when we look at the Russian strategy in Ukraine, it's currently so-called strategic deterrence, and the Russian now use all kinds of policies just deter the Ukraine to join the NATO, and also pursue the security guarantee from NATO, from the United States. So I just want to add another point to your first question about the current situation of the U.S., how the U.S. intelligence about the war in Ukraine. I may have another interpretation. I think that is how the United States try to, through the media, I disclose your secret, I disclose your war strategy. So that is kind of a way to stop the possible invasion or potential invasion. But I think the military activities along the borders for Russia is still limited. The Russia actually does not need a wall to achieve its goal, right? So I think the goal for Russia is still in there, is still limited. Yeah.
Okay, so Mark, how would you respond to this analysis by Professor Chu in that this kind of disclosure or revelation on the part from the U.S. security, intelligence security community is one of the American strategy to deal with Russia on this particular issue?
Yeah, I do agree that Russia's goals in Ukraine are limited, i.e., essentially Russia is perfectly fine with a neutral Ukraine. You have to remember that Ukraine is a divided country, socially, politically, largely along geographic lines between a West and an East. A West that has a monist, ultra-nationalist, for the moment, pro-Western national identity that is geopolitically very anti-Russian. While the east of Ukraine is a pluralist, multi-ethnic, Russian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, other minorities in the country, and is not anti-Russian. Right. And they don't necessarily want to be part of an anti-Russian state. And this is what we are looking at, an attempt to manufacture an anti-Russian Ukrainian nation and state in Ukraine by the West. They do not accept that an idea of a neutral or Finlandized Ukraine is acceptable for their goals, their goals of global hegemony in that part of the world, while Russia's limited strategic goals are, i.e., to keep NATO from turning Ukraine into a military outpost, right at its, if you want to call it, it's Russia's soft underbelly. Russia, their goals then are limited to one, security guarantees from NATO. Most particularly, although there is a whole host of these that would revisit much of NATO's, shall we say, militant posture towards the East since the end of the Cold War. But most importantly, would have guarantees that Ukraine would not become part of NATO and would not be NATOized informally with, be it the de facto military means. And they also want that the Minsk Accords will be fulfilled so that the regime in Kiev that seized power in 2014 finally politically reconciles with the east of their own country. Until then, Moscow will never consider the U.S.-backed regime in Kiev to be fully legitimate. And that's what they're looking for. But I do disagree with both of our prior commentators. I think that if Russia does not get guarantees that both of these limited goals are happening in the near future, I think it is actually seriously considering a further military intervention in Ukraine. It is not something that has been fully decided on, but there are capabilities that have been put in the west of Russia, at least according to U.S. intelligence analysis, and I agree with this, that while not massed along the Ukrainian border, do provide the options to then begin that process. And I think if we're taking a look at the language that has come out of the Russian foreign ministry, particularly Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, we see comments that unless these two things, the Minsk Accords and security guarantees from the U.S. and NATO, are met, that Russia will consider military technical countermeasures. Now, what does that mean? That is deliberately vague for a reason, but I do believe if we were to look at it in terms of U.S. government and military rhetoric, we would see something along the line of Russia saying that all options are on the table.
Now, Professor Grant, do you think Russia needs a war to achieve its geopolitical and strategic goal regarding this region or the Ukrainian issue?
Well, I think Russia would prefer to secure its objectives by negotiation. But, of course, as has just been said, it does have military options which it could use if it felt it wasn't making satisfactory progress. I mean, unfortunately, I think there have been certain parts of the Western media which have tried to intensify this crisis by using terms like aggression, which are emotionally loaded and which don't take account of the complexity of the situation in Ukraine. As has been pointed out, there are important differences between the east and west of the country. I mean, I don't think the Ukrainian population in general is anti-Russian. There may be people in leadership positions in the Ukraine who take that kind of position, but I don't think they're representative of the population as a whole. So there's no doubt, Russia would like to secure a negotiated solution if it can, but if it can't, then it may have to resort to other methods.
Okay, so Professor Chu, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, what does Ukraine mean to Russia, in your opinion?
So by now, I think the first that I already mentioned, that is the geopolitical, there are the geopolitical interest in Ukraine, and that is to prevent the eastern expansion of NATO. This is the first. And second, I think so by now, that is also the confrontation of the difference. The difference is between the Russia and the West, and especially the United States. And that is a test stone for Russia to look at how the United States and how the NATO to look at Russia and whether or not they still treat Russia as a threat. So now, and there is another thing that is for Russia that is also very important to. They already had the so-called red line, and they have how to keep that. That is to keep their credibility of commitment. Yes.
Okay. Now, Mark.